welcome to the Animal Training Academy Making Ripples podcast show, the show where we share the stories of the ripple-making extraordinaires with behavior nerd superpowers who make up the Animal Training Academy membership. I'm your host and one of the happiness engineers at Animal Training Academy, Shelley Wood from Drop Your Jaws Dog Training in Cape Girardeau, Missouri in the United States. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. Make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss a single episode. This show is brought to you on behalf of the Animal Training Academy membership. So if you like the conversations in these episodes, then we want to invite you to continue them with like-minded people in the ATA membership, which you can find out more about at www.atamember.com. Within the membership, you can get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalog of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help you problem solve your training challenges. And we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forums area. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behavior geeks. Started today where we will be talking to one Josephine Locke. Josephine Locke has been providing conservation scent detection services with her canine partner Willow since starting Nose No Limit in 2018 with the help and support of fellow ATA member David Thatcher. She has also been a live find search and rescue handler for the past 7.5 years. Jo became fascinated with animal behavior as a young child by collecting and observing the animals around her, first at her home near Oxford in the UK, and later in Bahrain, where her family lived until she was 15. With a degree in management science from the University of Wales and 3 years of doctoral research on a tool for strategic planning and decision-making, most of her career has been spent in the criminal justice and higher education sectors working with human behavior. In 2011, she moved to the USA with her husband and young son, and it was here that her fascination with canine scent detection, behavior science, and animal training really took off. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome one Josephine Locke to the show today. Jo, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us today. How are you doing this morning?
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think what you're doing with this podcast is really, really wonderful because the ATA is such a special and unique place, and there are so many amazing people in there. I can't wait to hear all the other people that you're going to interview.
I agree. I feel very lucky to get to be doing this, and there are tons of special and amazing people doing just such important and beautiful work out there in the world with the animals that they live and work with, and you are one of those people for sure. So I'm thrilled to have you as one of our first guests today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So like I said, I'm super excited to catch up with you this morning. I know you have a lot of amazing information to share, and so I just want to jump right into things here. It sounds like your educational and life background has been pretty interesting. I really enjoyed reading your bio, and I was wondering if you could maybe spend just a little bit of time kind of talking about your background, your educational and work background, and how that led you to the animal training community.
Well, sure. So it's kind of a convoluted trajectory, but if we go back to when I was very young, as a young child, I had a very early fascination with animals. I would spend hours in the backyard observing animals and collecting them and watching what they did. And as I got a bit older, I started to read lots of things about animals, and as I got more proficient as a reader, when I was about sort of 8, 9, 10, I got hooked on a couple of authors. One of them was Gerald Durrell, who was a very early conservationist. He wrote a number of books. One of his most famous book probably is My Family and Other Animals, which is about his life growing up in Corfu with his family. And I was very jealous of his childhood because he grew up in Corfu, and he spent his whole childhood just collecting animals, and he had a huge menagerie. When he grew up and started a career, he became a a conservationist because he set up Jersey Zoo and Conservation Trust, and his kind of primary focus was to try and help endangered species, and he bred them in captivity and then try and release them back into the wild. That was his main sort of goal in life. And then the other author I was really interested in was a guy called James Herriot, which was actually his pen name. His real name was Alf White. He sold millions of books, and he was a veterinarian in the Yorkshire Dales in the UK. Probably his most famous book is All Creatures Great and Small. And so at that age, I really wanted to be a vet. That was a veterinarian. That's kind of was my dream. But as I grew older, my fascination with human behaviour, and I think that's probably why I liked those two authors, because they used to weave animal and human stories together. So as I got older, I got more interested in human behaviour, and I was also interested in systems. Systems was also my big thing. So I started to study business and economics, and I went to university in Wales, in Swansea, and did a science degree in management science. And in the final year of that undergraduate degree, we were given the opportunity to take a new subject, which was called managerial cybernetics, with a visiting professor called Stafford Beer. And Stafford Beer lived in Toronto at the time, in Canada. So he would fly in for these classes a few times a year and teach us this subject, cybernetics. And I was so enthralled by it that I stayed on and did another 3 years doctoral research with him. So cybernetics is the science of effective organisation and regulation in large complex systems. And Stafford Beer was one of the founders of the subject. And one of the things that he invented and developed was a thing called the viable system model. And it was a model that you could apply to any system, whether it be an organic system or a business system or an organisational system. And it would help you to determine whether or not that system was functioning viably and healthily, and how to fix it if it wasn't. And there was two sort of features about the viable system model and two features about cybernetics that I think have a great bearing on what I now do and how I think about training now. And one of them is the law of requisite variety, which was coined by an early cybernetician called Ross Ashby. And the law of requisite variety states that only variety can absorb variety. And the definition of variety is the number of possible states of a system. So if you're looking at, say, a simple system like maybe a light switch, then the number of possible states is quite small. So you've got on, off, and I guess broken. And broken could mean several different things. So you might have a number of states of broken. But if you're talking about a more complex system like an organism, then obviously the number of states of the system get quite high. And the law of requisite variety says that if you want to control a system, then both sides of the equation have to be in balance, because only variety can absorb variety. So if I think about training, I think about that law as being like a mathematical expression of behaviour. And if you're a trainer and you're trying to train an animal to produce a certain behaviour, then you have to balance that equation somehow. So if you're wanting to, you would have to do two things to balance that equation out. And on the viable system model, Stafford denotes these using electrical symbols. One of them is an amplifier. So you'd have to amplify your variety and attenuate the variety of the thing you're trying to manage or control, or, the other side of the equation that you're trying to balance. So if we're looking at a training situation and you've got an animal that you're trying to train a behaviour to amplify your behaviour to be able to train that behaviour, you could do things like you could study applied behaviour analysis. So you get more knowledge and more more understanding of how behaviour works. You could practice, so you could use tools like PORTL, and practice the skills of how to train. You could write a plan of how you're going to train that behaviour, so you've got a strategy. So those are all sorts of things that you could do to amplify your variety. And then on the other side of the equation, the things that you could do to attenuate the behaviour of the animal to ensure that you get the behaviour that you're trying to train is that you could set up the antecedent arrangement to try and limit the number of possible behaviours that animal's going to exhibit. You could use prompts, you could use targets. Those are the things that you could do to attenuate that variety down so that you're more likely to get the behaviour that you're trying to train. Okay, so that was the first kind of cybernetic principle that really kind of like underpins a lot of my thinking and a lot of what I do in kind of everything. And then the other principle was levels of recursion. So what does that mean? So the viable system model that Stafford Beer created works no matter what level you apply it to. So if you take a system like, say, a school, then you could apply the viable system model to the classroom. You could apply it to the department within which that class exists. You could apply it to the whole school. So you'd have, so if you had 3 layers there, 3 levels of recursion, the viable system model is the same at every level. So it's a little bit like those wooden painted dolls that you get, where you've got a small doll inside a bigger doll inside a bigger doll, but each one of those dolls is identical and they fit exactly inside each other. So that's kind of the concept of levels of recursion. And I use that thinking a lot in the work that I do with when I'm thinking about systems, because it allows me to zoom in and out quite, it gives me the kind of like paradigm, I guess, to zoom in and out between tiny approximations and then back out again to the whole organism. So it's like going from micro to macro. So after university, after I'd done all that studying, my career was mainly involved project management. And most of it was involved in information technology. So I spent a lot of years setting up and managing project support offices to support really large IT projects. So really, I was kind of helping humans to cope with change. Most of those IT systems, kind of radically changed people's jobs and ways of working, and so it was my job to help ensure that those systems did the task that they were setting out to do, but also that the people adapted to those changes. And then fast forward to, I guess, 2011, and we moved to the United States. And at that time, I had a young son, and so I didn't go back to work. But what I did do is breed a litter of puppies, and one of those puppies we kept. And I wanted to do something with her. We'd brought our old Labrador with us from, she was about 3 when we brought her from the UK, 3 or 4, and we bred the litter of puppies with her. And she came from a long line of field trial champions, so she was a really smart dog and a wonderful. She still is. She's still with us. She's 13 and a half now. A wonderful family pet. And then so we had these puppies, and I wanted to do something with Willow, but I didn't want to do hunting. And someone suggested search and rescue, and that kind of opened up the door to scent detection for me. And I was lucky that I found a team that had some Karen Pryor Academy graduates, and I started to learn about ABA, I started to learn about positive reinforcement. And then we moved briefly a few years later to California for 2 years. And while I was there, I went really deep down the ABA rabbit hole and went to a few clicker expos and started to really study, did course after course after course. And it was during that time that I belonged to a group called the Dog Trainers Alliance of Southern California. And they organised a seminar they had Ken Ramirez to do a weekend seminar on his advanced training techniques. And I went to that seminar, and after the seminar, we had a luncheon with him, and I was lucky enough to sit next to him at the luncheon. And I started asking him about conservation work because, I'd seen him speak at Clicker Expo and discovered that not only could you do scent detection and search and rescue with your dog, but you could also do conservation, which took me right back to my childhood and all the things that I loved then. And I wanted to know how did you get into conservation work? And it sparked in me the inspiration to try and make it happen. So I thought about it, did a lot of research, found out about all the different other canine conservation groups that exist in the USA and around the world. Spoke to a lot of people, and slowly this idea started to formulate. One of my really good friends, Susan Conaway, helped me put together a logo. And when we moved back to Indiana, David Thatcher helped me make it a reality. And the two of us, still working together. He's a great source of advice and counsel for me, continues to be. So we kind of come back full circle to, and I'm so blessed to have been able to link together my love of conservation with my love of animal behaviour, with my love of scent detection and systems theory, and put it all together.
That is great, Jo. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all of that with us. I'm sure all of the listeners are going to enjoy hearing about it all just as much as I did. So much there to unpack. We're just going to have to pick a couple of the things, I think, before we move on. I did want to say one thing I wanted to note really quickly. You mentioned PORTL as a way that people could amplify themselves to build their skill sets when working with their animals, I believe. Do you mind maybe just real briefly kind of telling people what PORTL is? And we can then link to that in the show notes too, where folks can go to find out more about that.
Sure. Well, PORTL's an acronym. It stands for the Portable Operant Training and Teaching Laboratory, I think. And it was it came out of an idea that I think Kay Lawrence originally came up with, and she called it Janabacab. And it's basically a tabletop game where you use kind of toys and objects to teach the learner across the table from you, who's a human learner, how to do a certain behaviour. And you do it silently using only a marker. So you use a clicker or another kind of marker to mark correct behaviour. So it sort of simulates training an animal, but you do it with a human, and you get to practice the skills and you get to experiment in the different techniques without frustrating the real animal that you're trying to train. So it's a way of building skills and experimenting. And it was then, so she started it, but then it was taken over by kind of Mary Hunter and Jesus Rosales Ruiz at the University of North Texas, and they turned it into a teaching and training tool for their students at the university there. And they've recently published a manual and a kit, which you can purchase from their website, which I highly recommend.
Thank you for sharing that with everybody, Jo. And we will, like I said, link to that in the show notes for people who are interested in PORTL. And I also highly recommend it. I've had the opportunity to use it a few times, and I know a lot of us in the community have, so I'm glad you brought it up. It's a great, great tool. So yeah, lots of just wonderful, interesting stuff that you had to say there. I'm sure that many of the listeners, just like me, are going to be very jealous to hear that one of your first training events, it sounds like, you just happened to be seated right next to Ken Ramirez. What wonderful fortune that I would assume, and it sounds like helped set you on your path to conservation training. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit, maybe more detail about how you got started in conservation training. You mentioned some of the canine conservation groups. Just kind of wondering if you could share maybe about how some of those groups were a help to you, or what kinds of things that you did besides just getting lucky and sitting next to Ken Ramirez and chatting with him about conservation, but just maybe kind of specifically what kind of things you did that got you really going in the conservation world. I know David Thatcher, fellow ATA member, helped you out with this, or helped you on your journey to this world as well. But I feel like there are probably a lot of listeners who, just like myself, are really intrigued with the idea of doing something like conservation work with their dogs, and just wonder if there are any kind of practical tips you have for people that might be interested in learning more or starting on this path.
Okay, well, it's there is no simple answer to the question, and luck plays an awful lot in the success. I owe a lot to kind of who I know and the help that I've had. So Ken Ramirez produced one of his, I think it's one of Ken's letters that the KPA website published, where he talks about this, and he talks about so that's a very good starting point. He gives you some tips as to how you can get started. So I kind of followed a lot of that advice. I was also very fortunate at the time that I was doing, so I did Kay Lawrence's 2-year tackle course. I was doing that at the time. And she put me in touch with one of the ex-students of that course, Laura Holder, who is the executive director of Midwest Conservation Dogs in Wisconsin. So she's been an awful lot of help. She's been a great source of information and help to me over the years. And other than that, you really just have to find out about what's happening in your area. So you have to talk to the conservation groups that are local to you, find out what animals and what species they're trying to protect, find out about the projects they're involved in, probably volunteer to help in some of those projects, and find out if there are any projects where a dog might be helpful in finding the target that they're trying to protect. And obviously having a search and rescue background and having some, already experience and knowledge of training scent detection and handling a scent detection dog was a great deal of help to me too.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. It sounds like some nice kind of action steps that people could take to learn more about conservation work, and we will link to some of that to all of that in the show notes. And I think that segues right into the next thing that I wanted to ask you about. I have had the opportunity to chat with you a little bit before, and also to read a little bit about your work with Willow and how you decided when you started working with conservation work with her, how you decided that you needed a different indicator behavior from her than the one you had for search and rescue. So when she got to the target odor in conservation work, you needed her to behave differently than the way that she behaves when she gets to the target in search and rescue. So I wonder if you could, I think the process that you went through to determine what kind of behavior would work for you is really interesting, as well as the process that you use to train that new indicator behavior. So I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit this morning.
So let's talk about search and rescue first of all. So there are lots of different fields of search and rescue. So you have basically the division between live, find, and human remains. So that's the first kind of division. But even within live find, which is what Willow does, there are different sorts of search and rescue dogs. So you can have a tracking trailing dog that takes a scent article and basically follows the trail that was left by that person. So in order to use a tracking trailing dog, you have to have a point last seen or a last sighting where you knew that person was before they disappeared. And you give the dog a scent article, and then the dog will track that trail and give you the direction of travel. And, if they haven't strayed too far, the tracking dog may even, be able to trail far enough to find the missing person. But an area dog will is not scent specific. So you don't give them an article, although you can, that's another story, but you don't typically give them an article and say, find this specific person. What you do is you ask them to search for any human odor in an area. And usually area dogs are very useful when you don't know where the person is and you don't know where they you haven't got a point last seen, you just know that they've disappeared somewhere in, and you're trying to eliminate, process of elimination to try and figure out where they might be. So you don't even know if there's any humans in the area. So the dog, typically an area dog will range much further. They typically put their nose in the air. They call it air scenting rather than down on the ground, although, again, it's not strictly a division, because an area dog, if they find the trail, if they find human scent, they will trail them to their location just as a tracking training dog, but they tend to do it much faster and at speed because they're not as detailed. So they range much farther. So Willow's search and rescue behaviour is she typically, when I set her searching, she will take off and she will be hunting for the odour. She will be trying to find the slightest whiff of human odour, and she could travel quite a long distance from me, and most often out of sight. She can be out of sight quite a lot of the time, and she does these huge kind of sweeping loops around me. So my first challenge was to try and bring that search behaviour down to much tighter, methodical kind of grid searching for conservation, because I didn't want that. She needed to be within sight the whole time, and she needed to be more systematic, and she needed to take more direction from me to do gridding backwards and forwards. And in search and rescue, you really don't want to influence the dog too much. You don't want to be there guiding them, because you want them to lead you to the person. Whereas in conservation, you want to be able to grid the area and cover the ground more systematically. So the conversation between the two of you has more words going on back and forth. Whereas in search and rescue, you kind of let the dog do the work, and other than keeping them inside the area and keeping them safe, the directions are kept to a minimum. The other problem I had with the transition was that her search and rescue alert is an active alert. So she's what's called a refined dog. So she will find the missing person, then she will come barreling back to me. She jumps up and nose punches a rubber chicken I have attached to my belt. The rubber chicken has a squawker inside it, so the rubber chicken will squawk, and I say, "Show me," and then she spins around and takes me back to the person. And in conservation, what I needed was a much more passive alert. I needed her to find the target and then to give me an indication to say I found the target, and to stay stationary and stay put with the target until I come to her to verify that she's found the target and to give her her reward. So for her, it was very, very different, because her instinct with search and rescue is to leave the target and come running back to me. And I needed something much more subdued and much more passive, and the complete opposite of what she was doing before. So my first kind of way to tackle this was to sort of just explore all the different options out there, and to get some experience and some knowledge from people that have trained dogs to do this kind of approach of searching. So I enrolled on a CyberScent course with Sarah Owings and Helix Fairweather, and they teach how to train dogs for nose work. And the typical alert for nose work is a nose hold. So the dog finds the nose work oil that it's searching for, and it basically puts its nose very close to the source and freezes in place to indicate that they found the target. And I needed something like that, but I needed it not to be like a fixed nose hold right on the target, because the sorts of things we were going to be looking for would be plants possibly, and also animals. So I didn't want the dog's face right up against the target like that. I needed something further at a distance. And I also, during that time, I remember it came up in my tackle course, talking about the alert, and Kay Lawrence asked me the question, when would this behaviour happen naturally? And I thought about what she was saying, and I thought, having the dog, freeze and stare at the thing that it's looking for is that when you see that behaviour naturally in dogs, it's usually part of hunting. So if a dog is like maybe staring at a hole where a mouse just disappeared into, and I thought about the emotion that would be part of that behaviour and the function of that behaviour, and I thought, well, I really don't want that kind of intensity of staring at something. And also it would have to have a lot of duration, because she could find the target a fair distance from me, and I would have to then cover that distance between me and her to bring her her reward, and she might have her back to me, which is quite a hard behaviour to ask for a dog to do, to sort of stay frozen in place staring at something knowing that you're behind them, approaching them with their toy, and to not move. So thinking through all of these different things, I decided that the best behaviour, the one that was going to suit me the best to cover, anything that we might have to do, would be to stand and stare at me. So find the target, put your nose close to it, verify that you found what you're looking for, lift your head, turn around, stare at me, stay planted in place until I get to you. So the way I went about training it was to, first of all, concentrate on the bit that I considered would be the hardest for the dog, which was, for my dog, for my individual dog, given her learning history, was the staying planted in place while I came to her with the ball. So I started off with a hula hoop as the target, and so I trained her to stay within the hula hoop with her feet on the ground, and I started first of all close up to her with a high rate of reinforcement and tight loops of her just staying stationary in that hoop. And gradually I built out distance and therefore duration by backing up and then coming forward and backing up and coming forward until I could get to a point where I could walk from quite a long way away and she would stay in that hoop. And that's when I started to think about introducing the scent. So I then turned it around to her going out to the hoop. So the hoop became a visual cue to go and stand, and she knew food would come to her there. So if I put odour in the hoop, she would then go to the hoop and discover the odour. And then she would sniff it, and she would automatically lift her head, look at me and watch me coming to be fed. So then the odour became the cue for the behaviour. And so at that point, I could gradually fade the hoop. And the hoop that I used came apart in sections. So I could take it apart section by section until the odour was the only salient cue for her to... So she would then... And she already had, search as an ability. So she could then go to the odour, and that was the cue to turn around and give me the alert. And then the other half of it was really to change the search style. So using these tighter grids, and the way that I tackled that was the way that I placed the articles. So I first of all kind of used naturally enclosed spaces. So things like soccer fields and things like that were helpful places, fenced in places. And then I started to expand that out using natural boundaries like tree lines, and gradually kind of generalizing to more and more natural and wild environments until it didn't really matter where we were. She would understand that we were doing a different search pattern and a different search style. And then I guess my biggest fear about the whole thing was that I had to keep the whole... I wanted to make sure that I didn't break her search and rescue behaviours. So I had to be very careful that she understood there was a completely different context between the two different things, so that I could, when I asked her to search for humans, I would get the behaviour I described that she does for search and rescue. And when I asked her to search for whatever conservation target we had that day, she would display the other behaviours for searching and for the alert. So I had to create a very different antecedent picture. So with the search and rescue, I have a verbal cue of go search, and it's delivered very emphatically, and it's delivered with a different presentation. So I crouch down beside her and we're eye to eye, and she's just like a coiled spring, just waiting to be released. And she's glancing at me and looking forward and glancing at me, and I whisper in her ear really, really sort of emphatically, go search, and she just takes off. The conservation alert is the verbal cue is locate, and I usually start her off in a down position, and I stand in front of her and I deliver the cue very casually and very subdued, and I just sort of wave my hand and say locate. So it's a different presentation. There's also different equipment. So with search and rescue, she's got a harness, and with conservation, she's got a specific collar. It's quite a wide collar with all her information, and there's a metal plate on it with my phone number and the fact that she's a search dog and things. So she has a very different tactile experience when she does those two different search styles. And then there's also different visual cues with what I'm wearing and different contexts, because she can tell when we're out with our search team and we're doing search training, as opposed to when I'm out with her in the field doing conservation. So I wanted those two antecedent pictures to be very, very different, because I wanted to be absolutely sure that there would be no interference with her search and rescue behaviour, because obviously that, when she's doing search and rescue, human lives are at stake.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think it's fascinating every time that I hear you talk about it or I read about the process all the way. And I learn something a little bit new every time, like your influence from Kay Lawrence that you talked about at the beginning of thinking about, what is the function of this behavior that I'm trying to train? What would the function of this behavior be naturally? And does it make sense to train it in this situation, So really interesting to hear you kind of talk about your process in thinking about that, your process in training the behavior, why it needed to be different for nose work, and then the differences in your context cues, which it sounds like are really important for you and Willow in both of the different types of work that you do together. So in thinking about that, I wonder, are there any other either specific behaviors or training situations that have been challenging? I'm sure probably not, right? That's the only challenging behavior you've ever dealt with, I imagine.
Well, no.
Well, I wonder if you might share about another training challenge or training situation, and if you used any of those same kind of things to help you as you processed through the training challenge. You may not have, so it's fine if you didn't, but just wonder if you could share a little bit about another training challenge that you've experienced.
Okay. Well, I could briefly tell you a little bit about one of the projects we're working on currently. We're working with the Eco Lab at the Nina Mason Polyam Eco Lab at the Marian University here in Indianapolis. And they have a 75-acre preserve, which they use to help educate the students. They use for classes. They do all sorts of summer camps and things there. And one of the species that they protect there is the eastern box turtle, which is threatened in Indiana. And for a while now, they've had a few of their box turtles with radio transmitters on them, and they've been studying their behaviour. And one of the things they want to discover is whether or not the Eco Lab is a viable environment for these creatures to sort of thrive and survive, because it's a fairly small space, and they don't really know how many turtles they have there, and they don't know whether or not the space is big enough to accommodate the number of turtles they have, and they don't know if the turtles have enough, diversity and enough habitat to survive long term, and they also want to know what these guys are up to all the time. They want to know what they're doing, what they're eating, how far they travel, and so they've been having some trouble finding them because they are quite elusive. They're a land-dwelling turtle. They live in forest, and they're very well camouflaged. And so the ones that they've got tagged at the moment, they've basically stumbled across by accident mostly. And so they were intrigued to see if dogs was going to be a way of being able to find them more reliably, which is where we came in. And what we've discovered is that it's not this particular scent profile has not been as easy to locate as I anticipated. And so I've been kind of exploring all the different aspects of that. So there are a number of things that I considered. I considered whether or not the scent training was the same as the live situation, because I trained using scent swabs from captive turtles over the winter, which is a different scent profile and a different, size of scent pool. And also it's a kind of a very different profile in that you're when you put a scent swab down into an area, it's just, a static pool of scent in one specific spot that you've placed in the environment for the dog to find. It's not quite the same as a turtle that's been moving around in an area, probably going round and round in circles all over the same area for, a number of days, weeks, months. So the kind of area is like flooded with the scent, and then the dog's got to pick through all of that to try and figure out and pinpoint the strongest source and see where the actual, the source of the scent's emanating from. So that's quite complex. And the other difficulty of the ecolab is that it's very, the plant life is very thick. It's very hard to see your dog working, because once she goes in to start searching, she kind of disappears in amongst all the trees and the shrubs and the grasses. So I had to try a number of different things to try and overcome some of this stuff, and I'm still working through it, as I said. One of the things I did was I went to a different location where there were some turtles that were being studied by a different university, by Dr. Carlson in Wabash College. And they have an area where they've been studying turtles for a different project. And they live in sort of ancient forest where the understory is very, because the tree canopy is so thick, the understory's very sparse, and you can see the ground and you can see your dog from a long distance away. And I discovered that the same problem existed there, and that unless she was very close to the turtle, it seemed much harder for her to actually pinpoint their exact spot compared to the other scents that she'd learnt. So I'm still exploring all this stuff. I've spoken to a number of researchers at different universities. There's one in Canada that's been working with turtles, and I spoke to a number of other conservation groups that have searched for turtles who have also discovered some of these difficulties. And there's some theories floating around that maybe they have an ability to somehow make their scent less obvious. There's no real research on that yet, but I know there's some potentially being done, so that's quite an interesting thing to keep on top of and explore. But really what I'm thinking is that it's just going to require more practice and more working through. And also what I'm going to try and do is change up what we do, and maybe next year we're going to look for the turtles while they're still in hibernation, because these guys hibernate a few inches below the ground over winter. And dogs can find things underground up to a reasonably, you'd be surprised how deep they can go. They can find human remains underground. I know there's some dogs that find oil spills underground. So I think the scent profile of a turtle that's been in a hibernation hole all winter, and there's probably excreta in there. There's probably, some feces and urine that we could also use as a target scent. And I think it might be interesting to see how that compares to the dogs finding the live animals once they've come out of their hibernation and are moving around. So that's kind of the next plan with that project.
Yeah, well, that definitely sounds like a training challenge, and an interesting one at that. I really love the different hypotheses that are out there, like that. I believe you said there's some work being done that the turtles, to see if they might be able to make their scent less obvious by some people. That is really interesting for sure. And then also your theory is very interesting as well, and I'll definitely be looking forward to hearing what you find out when you try that. Will you be trying that over this coming winter, do you think?
Yeah, that's my plan. So I've been gathering, swabs of urine and turtle poop, and so I have a box
Perfectly
of
normal.
that in my freezer. Perfectly normal, yeah. So I've got a few. I'm very lucky that I've got lots of nature centres around here that are very willing and interested in the project and want to help. So they text me and go, "Joe, I've got a big poo for you to pick up," and so yeah, totally normal. So I'm busy kind of collecting scent for that over the winter, and then early spring next year. But we were going to kind of try it this year, but of course COVID stopped us being able to get out in the field. And by the time we did get out in the field, it was kind of June, and that's when the undergrowth was really thick. So we didn't really get started as early as we wanted to with this project. So I'm really keen on seeing what it's going to be like next year. Fingers crossed we can get out there early.
On average, I guess, when do turtles typically go into hibernation for the winter?
It really depends on the weather. And I'm not sure what temperature it has to drop to, but I would imagine, I think it's kind of around about October, maybe November, but probably earlier, probably kind of September, October. The weather in Indiana can get quite cold quite quickly. So.
And will it just be you and Willow working on this project, or will there be multiple teams working on it, do you think?
At the moment, it's just me and Willow. There's a possibility that that David might get involved in this one, but right now it's just me and Willow.
Okay, very cool. Well, I'm definitely interested to hear what you find out, and hopefully you'll even get some video of some of that some of us can see. Wonderful. Jo, all of your work sounds so incredibly meaningful, from the search and rescue work to the conversation. I'm enjoying our conversation, which is also meaningful, but to the conservation work. It all sounds just so meaningful to me, and I imagine it's all super rewarding for you as well. I'm sure that all of the projects that you've been involved in, all the ones you've talked about today for sure, and I'm sure all of the ones that you've been involved in have been important, but I'm wondering if there is one, or if there are one or two that stand out as some of the projects that you view as maybe the most important, or just some that were just really significantly important to you that you could chat about for a minute.
Okay. Well, there's one project that it was actually the first project that we did, and it wasn't the project itself, it was what came afterwards that really stands out to me, that I probably want to talk about, which is, so in the fall of 2019, we worked on bat and bird carcass surveys underneath wind turbines in Indiana. So when a wind farm is constructed, the first thing that happens is there is a number of surveys and pre-construction kind of analyses to make sure that the wind farm is sited in such a way that it's not going to have a huge adverse impact on wildlife. So that will involve an awful lot of people. That will involve kind of US Fish and Wildlife and environmental consultancy companies and local conservation groups. And what will happen is they will do a habitat conservation plan, and they would look at all the different species that might be impacted, and they will make sure that the wind farm is going to be sited in the right place. And once they've done that, this habitat conservation plan will inform them of what species might be impacted. And if any of those species are endangered or threatened, then the Fish and Wildlife will give the energy company an incidental take permit, which basically specifies and limits the amount of environmental impact that they can have. And then they will be required to conduct surveillance and to make sure that the impact is not going beyond the terms of their permit. And that's where the dogs come in. So we did these surveys in 2019, and we spent several months out there on our own, day after day, searching turbines for dead bats and dead birds. And after that project was over, I became very interested in finding out a lot more about the problem, and find out how long it had been happening and what we knew about it and what were the causes and what solutions were being put in place to try and resolve it. So I spent the next 5 or 6 months just reading up and researching and studying and trying to understand all that had already been discovered about this situation. And at the end of that, I wrote a paper, a kind of white paper or a project proposal, because I discovered that there are already quite a lot of things happening and a lot of solutions being put forward. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought about a possible solution which comes from our behaviour analysis knowledge and our training knowledge. And I thought, I wonder if this would be a way to resolve this problem. So I thought, I'm going to write all this down. So I wrote this paper, which set out all that I discovered about what is already known about the problem. And then I put forward this hypothesis of how we might add to the solutions and whether this would complement the existing solutions to help reduce the number of bat deaths. And my hope with the paper was that somebody out there would read it, would kind of run with it and take it on, because it requires someone to lead it. It requires, some collaboration and a multidisciplinary team put together to test it, to test whether or not, first of all, whether there's any, it has legs and it's actually going to have an impact, but also to make sure that it doesn't have any adverse effects that we don't intend and make the situation worse. So somebody out there, I hope, is going to, at some point, pick this paper up and run with it and do something with it. But to give you some background on what I discovered, first of all, I discovered that bats are extremely competent flyers. They have wings that consist of a number of bones and a flexible membrane, which allows them to produce very complex shapes. And I had lots of conversations about this with my husband because he's an aerodynamicist. So this is that kind of floats his boat, and he got very excited about some of that and talked about being able to put, models in the wind tunnel and and all sorts of things like that. Anyway, so bats are very competent flyers, and they also have echolocation abilities that allow them to detect moving objects better than they can detect stationary ones, which is what makes them such good hunters. So it's kind of intriguing why this is happening, and I'll get on to some of the research on that. And then I looked at kind of why is this important and how big a problem is it? And the answer is that it's not really that clear. Obviously it varies. So it varies. It varies geographically. So, as I said before, one of the biggest and most important ways to mitigate this is to make sure those wind farms are sited in good positions and not in positions near, bat hibernation points or, bat habitat. But the impact varies. It varies geographically, and it varies. It also varies at the time of year. So we'll get onto that as well. But it impacts certain species more than others, and it impacts them at a certain time of the year more than others. So we'll get onto some of that in a second. And it's as I said, it's unknown exactly how many bats are being killed every year this way. But I did find one study published in 2016. It was a study done in Canada, and they found that on average there was 15.5 bats killed per turbine per year on the turbines that they studied. And if that can be a fairly accurate, and we don't know this, but if that was a fairly accurate measure, and we looked at the mathematics of that, there are currently over 63,000 turbines in the USA. So that would equate to nearly 1 million bats a year. So, this is obviously a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And there are, multiple people looking at this and multiple organisations and billions of dollars being thrown at it. So the significance of it is definitely being recognised. And the reason why it's so important is that bats, they help balance out our ecosystems. They save farmers billions of dollars in pest control. Some species of bat can eat more than half their body weight in insects in one single night. So they're very, very important for the environment. They're also already under a lot of stress because we have a white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease in the USA at the moment, which is wiping out bats in very large numbers. And bats are also very slow to recover because quite a lot of species only have one pup a year. So they don't recover very well to mass extinction events. And although most of the species that are badly affected by turbines aren't necessarily the ones that are currently endangered, we don't necessarily know how populous those species are. And there have been studies to show that if the numbers keep being, affected to the extent that they are being, some of those species could be pushed towards, a state of being more threatened or endangered. And then obviously we need wind turbines because we need renewable energy, we need to reduce our carbon emissions, and we need to remove any impediments to the expansion of that green and renewable energy. So this is a very serious problem to be resolved. And as I said, there are, I don't know how many hundreds, thousands of researchers working on it. And I must have read like 100 papers or more. And what I discovered was that there's no real consensus as to the causes of this. It primarily affects tree roosting bats, and it primarily affects them during their fall migration. And during their fall migration, these bats are heading south to hibernate or to go to winter feeding grounds. And during that movement, they're increasing their feeding and mating behaviours. So there's been lots of hypotheses put forward that perhaps they're mistaking these turbines for trees, or so they're looking for roosts, or they're looking for mates, or they're perhaps hunting, looking for food. There's been some research to suggest that the paint colours that turbines are painted in, the paler colours attract more insects. There's been some other theories and hypotheses researched where, because insects migrate as well, and insects tend to take advantage of the faster flowing air above the boundary layer, and turbines can interfere with that. So perhaps, the bats are being attracted by insects that are easier to hunt around them. I mean, there's another theory that's been explored that the smooth texture of the turbines when the bats when the echolocation bounces off them, bats are getting a signal back to them that makes it look like it's water and they're coming in to drink from the turbines and hitting them. So there's been some experiments to see whether textured paint will make a difference. So there's all sorts of research out there and theories, but the conclusion is that no one really knows what's happening. But what I did discover is that, so there was an experiment done in 2012 in Indiana. And for 163 odd nights, they gathered thousands of hours of footage, and they used lots of technology to study this. So they put radar. They used radar to look at the number of bats and flying animals coming through the area. So they had some indication of the population that was coming through. Then they used infrared cameras to film the individual bat and turbine interactions and to study those. And they also used acoustic detectors to ID the species that they were seeing. And they examined all this footage, and over 90% of the footage that they looked at, they could see that the bats were actively changing course or actively approaching the turbines, actively being attracted to them in some way. So it's not like they're just flying along and just, accidentally smashing into these things. There's something about them that's giving them, the stimuli that makes them think there's something attractive about them that they want to access. So when I started to think about all of that stuff and think about what we know as behaviour analysts, I started to think about, how you would go about resolving that. So to talk about some of the solutions that already exist, I've talked about sighting and surveillance, so that's happening all the time. But one of them, probably the main way that this is being mitigated right now is a thing called curtailment, which is changing the cut-in speed of the turbines. Because bats generally don't fly above a certain wind speed. So if they have a cut-in speed of, say, 5 or 6 meters a second, they can reduce the bat death significantly. But of course, the problem with that is that when you curtail the blades and stop them spinning, you're not generating any power. So it has a huge impact on, financial impact on the turbine companies. What they are trying to do now is a thing called smart curtailment. So that takes into account not just the wind speed, but also some meteorological data, because there's also a lot of research out there to show when these bats are flying through. So, it's known that certain species prefer to fly at certain barometric pressures, or they follow storm fronts, or they come ahead of storm fronts, or so there are meteorological factors that you can use to predict when bats are more likely to be flying, and then you can combine that with the cut-in speeds to try and have the most impact on reducing deaths. And then the other thing that's been happening is there's been a number of companies producing and developing ultrasonic acoustic deterrents. So these things are broadcasting over loudspeakers ultrasonic noise, which basically jams the echolocation and makes it very, I guess, unpleasant for the bats to try and navigate inside the turbine space. So they have to kind of flood the whole windswept zone with these noises. So they have to fit speakers, several speakers on the turbine blades, and they have to fit them on every single turbine to prevent the bats from wanting to fly in that zone. So those are sort of some of the solutions that are out there. So going back to kind of thinking about what might be attracting and what the function of this behaviour might be, I started to think about what we could do to motivate a safer behaviour, how we could get a replacement behaviour that was safer. So how would we motivate and encourage and increase the likelihood of bats engaging in a safer, incompatible behaviour? And I started to research wildlife corridors. So there are already a number of projects out there which connect up habitat and existing wild spaces, and in order to allow migratory animals to move from one place to another. So in out west, there's the Y2Y project, which is the connecting the Yukon to Yellowstone, and every year they kind of expand and connect up more and more areas. Down in Florida, there's a wildlife corridor down there, and in South America, there's one called the Jaguar Corridor Initiative. And some of these things don't actually have to be all that big. So in Chicago, on the lakeshore there's a place called Burnham Wildlife Corridor, and that's a refuge for 3 million migratory birds every year as they fly through. When we study birds, there's lots of research on migratory birds, and we already know that they take advantage of weather patterns and air currents, and there are certain routes that migratory birds tend to follow. In the ocean, we already know that there are ocean currents, and there are certain routes that migrating animals like whales, regularly use. So I started to wonder whether or not this was a way that we could perhaps start to motivate bats to fly right by those turbines and access their resources somewhere else. So I kind of put together this paper with some of these ideas in it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we'd have to build this from scratch. It would basically be starting out with maps and looking at where the turbine sites are currently, where new ones are planned, and then looking at what we already have. So in Indiana, for example, we have a huge area of forest called the Hoosier National Forest. We have lots of state parks. We have lots of land trusts. We have rivers with natural areas alongside the banks. We have lots of private land that's out there that is already natural habitat. So how can we join up some of these things? How can we help to interconnect them? How can we enhance them so that they are more diverse and have more of the species of plants and trees that the bats need for their resources? So we know what sort of trees and what sort of environments some of these tree roosting bats prefer. How do we enhance these spaces to maximize that potential? How do we plant the natives that attract the insects that these bats feed on? So basically I looked at all of that, and then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, there's so many win-wins here, because there are so many added benefits. Even if it doesn't have an impact on the bats, any funding that you were to put into this would also be helping all the other species that we have, not just migratory species, but all the native insects and birds and mammals. And so we could pool all those funding pots and all that knowledge and all that. We could have a huge kind of collaboration, all working towards the same goals, and have much better funding efficiencies. It would support legislation that's already existing and kind of going through Congress right now, like the 2019 Wildlife Corridors Act and the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. There's also Fish and Wildlife are currently trying to promote a habitat conservation plan that's multi-state, so it covers 8 Midwest states, so it would pull together some of that initiative. It would be beneficial for farmers. It would even be beneficial for humans, because if you're generating corridors like that, you could start including some human recreational things like cycle routes or kayaking routes. You could combine that with leisure activities as well as conservation. So that's kind of my big idea, and I'm really hoping that somebody out there listening to this or just finding out about the paper. I've been basically sending it out to people here and there and trying to spread the word, but it's very hard to know where to start because it's such a big thing. It's not like a small idea, but it needs to start small. It needs to start on perhaps one turbine and one small area, one wind farm or one small area, and it needs to be researched. It definitely needs some academics thrown at this. It needs somebody to test whether or not this is viable and whether it's going to have any impact on mortality rates. But also, I'm very keen that it's checked to make sure it doesn't have any unintended consequences. So, corridors potentially could have some, side effects, undesirable side effects, such as, if you create the ability for migration, species to migrate, you're also potentially creating the ability for invasives to spread or diseases to spread or predation to increase. So you have to make sure that those unintended side effects aren't going to be worse than the problem that you're trying to fix. But I can't help feeling that, what we know about behaviour, that trying to encourage the bats to engage in a safer, incompatible behaviour is a more sustainable long-term solution than trying to put deterrents on every single turbine we build.
Yeah.
Just because of the sheer costs involved.
I would agree. It definitely seems to be a good place to look. And I can see why this is the project that you chose to talk about as one of the most important or meaningful projects that you've been involved in. And it's unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, or coming to the end of our time here together today, but it's also really cool because it just ties right back into the very beginning, in my view anyway, of what we were talking about how your background and how you came to training in a systems way of looking at things, because you're definitely talking about a lot of different systems impact as you talk about this project, which is really interesting. So how would somebody get a hold of this white paper? I agree with you. It's important, somebody out there, everybody should read it, but somebody out there really needs to read it. So how could that person get a hold of this if they wanted to?
Well, I could put it out onto the internet and provide you with a link for the show notes for sure. I have currently been sending it out via email, and I've been linking in with people. So I've been building up my LinkedIn network, and I've been connecting with, academics and bat researchers and renewable energy experts, and sending it out to people like one-on-one, kind of making individual contacts and saying, hey, I've got this idea, and sending it to them. But I could certainly put it out and give you the link to it.
Wonderful. And then what if somebody, I'm sure everybody like me wants to find out more about what you have going on with Nose No Limit and just any of the work that you're involved in. So could you just briefly tell people how they can get in touch with you, where they can go to find out what you're up to with your conservation work or any other training work that you're involved in that you want folks to look into a little bit more? How can people find you?
Okay, yeah, sure. Am I briefly allowed to thank some people? So I've got some friends that really helped me with that back paper in terms of editing and helping me chase down references. So just quickly, Whitney Yerger, Coralie Palmer, and Ava Rudisil, who's a member of ATA. Just really thankful for all the support. I mean, there's probably loads of other people I'm forgetting, and I apologise, but I had a lot of support putting that paper together. Website. We have a website. It is www.nosenolimit.com, and that's all one word. And obviously, it's the nose on your face, not KNO. And then Instagram is nose_no_limit. And then we also have a Facebook page, which is Nose No Limit. And we're also on LinkedIn. There's a LinkedIn page. You can find us there too.
Great. And I assume is Nose No Limit on LinkedIn as well?
Yes, it's Nose No Limit on LinkedIn.
Okay, yeah. Wonderful. And thanks for giving a shout out to the folks that helped you with this. None of us do anything by ourselves, do we?
No. Never.
Definitely lucky to have people helping us for sure. And a couple of those folks that you thanked are members of the Animal Training Academy as well. So hopefully we'll have a chance to chat with them on this podcast one day in the future too.
Well, Ava actually trains diabetic alert dogs, so she would definitely be someone interesting to talk to.
Wonderful. Yeah, that sounds very interesting to hear more about. Well, Jo, we will link to everything that you shared about in the show notes. It has been great catching up with you and chatting this morning. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. So from myself, on behalf of everybody listening to this podcast today, just thank you very much for joining us and sharing about your amazing work with us today.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it. It's been great. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
We do, of course, appreciate all of you tuning in as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and are interested in carrying on the conversation about working with the animals in our lives in the most positive, most fun, and most choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.atamember.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behavior geeks. That's it for this episode, though. Thank you so much for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.